Hi everyone. In this lecture I want to talk to you about the historical and social context in which Shakespeare wrote his plays. Now, this context is referred to as the European Renaissance or the early modern period. Shakespeare is also referred to as an Elizabethan writer because Queen Elizabeth was the monarch when he wrote most of his plays. Although by the time he wrote the Tempest, James was ruling England, so technically the Tempest is a Jacobean play. But I will be using Renaissance, early modern and Elizabethan more or less interchangeably in these lectures, even though they don't mean exactly the same thing. Then I also want to ask the question, what is the relevance of the Renaissance to us in South Africa in 2021? In other words, why do we remain interested in something that happened 500 years ago? I can start by giving you the short answer to the first question. The Renaissance was a movement in art and science and politics that started in Italy in the late 13th century, in other words, the late 1200s. It was originally centered in the city-states of Florence and Siena, where wealthy families like the de Medici supported scholarship and art. And there are really three Italian figures who are particularly associated with the early Renaissance. The first is Dante, and especially his book, The Divine Comedy, which was written at the end of the 13th century. So in The Divine Comedy, the poet tells in the first person about his travels through the three realms of the dead, hell, purgatory, and paradise. And I think even now, The Divine Comedy is a wild and rambunctious read, and it's often really surprisingly funny. You should see where Dante puts lawyers. At the time, it also stood out for being written in vernacular Italian, during a period where people still thought Italian was basically just really bad Latin. It wasn't recognized as a language of art and scholarship, and Dante kind of recuperated Italian as a literary language. Then there's Boccaccio, who's famous for his book Decameron. That's where the Italian restaurant in Stellenbosch gets its name from, by the way. Now in this book, a group of young men and women flee from plague-ridden Florence to a villa in the countryside. When I say plague-ridden, I mean the bubonic plague, by the way, which killed at least 1/3 of the population of Europe, which I think is something that's really important to understand if we're talking about the context of the Renaissance. Massive death, illness. I mean, this thing was like COVID on steroids. So the protagonists in the Decameron are basically self-isolating in lockdown. And then to pass the time, each member of the party tells one story for each one of the nights that they spend at the villa. And the book is marked by this contrast between the death and suffering outside and this bawdy celebration of life inside. And then finally Francesco Petrarca, who's also known as Petrarch in English, and he's the founder of what we now call the Petrarchan sonnet, which influenced Shakespeare and many other writers in the Renaissance very strongly. His sonnets are addressed to this idealized woman, and they deal specifically with the pain and pleasure of unrequited love. The kind of love that he describes, this yearning for someone who's unobtainable, is also referred to as Petrarchan love, and it's a topic that we'll explore in more detail when we look at the Tempest. Now, by the 16th century, the Renaissance had finally reached England. 300 years might sound like a long time, but it's worth remembering that ideas moved slowly in this period, and that England at the time was a relative backwater. It was a sort of a forgotten part of the old Roman Empire without much influence in the world, and it stayed that way until at least the 15th or 16th century. If you want to read just one fantastic readable book about the Renaissance, please have a look at this book by Stephen Greenblatt. It's called The Swerve, and it deals specifically with the way a young humanist scholar called Poggio Bracciolini rediscovered and spread the ideas of Lucretius, the materialist Roman philosopher who was largely ignored and even vilified during the medieval period. It reads like a detective story. Really, I couldn't put it down. And it's incredibly informative about all aspects of the Renaissance. Greenblatt is a well-known Renaissance scholar, but this book is written for a more popular audience. If you can't find a copy in the library, or you don't have access to a library at the moment, please send me an email if you're interested. So, what was the Renaissance exactly? The word literally means rebirth, renaissance, rebirth. People in the early modern period coined the term to talk about themselves. They saw it as a movement, you know, like Fees Must Fall or something. Many of the important figures in the Renaissance also knew each other personally. Now we have to ask, what was being born again as far as they were concerned? In other words, what had been dead but was now being returned to life? And the answer is it was the learning of classical antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome. They felt that they were reviving classical ancient Roman and Greek philosophy and thought after this long dark spell of the Middle Ages. The people who came up, you know, with this concept or this name, the Renaissance, were also called humanists. And humanism was an important new concept, a way of understanding the self and the world that we will talk about more as we go along. Now, this idea of the Renaissance was actually originally a form of self-advertising. They were basically saying, okay, nothing interesting has happened for the last 600 years. People have basically become barbarians. But now we are returning to the great ignored thoughts of ancient Greece and Rome. Now, of course, we should treat this kind of story with suspicion. Things obviously did happen in those 600 years. I won't go into that now, but if you do read Greenblatt's book, it'll give you a pretty good idea. In some ways, the Renaissance was really a phenomenon that that affected a small, very wealthy section of the population. Some theorists actually argue that the early Renaissance was a worse time in many ways, intellectually, in terms of the general quality of life, than the high medieval period, which saw a new flourishing of knowledge. But despite the fact that the Renaissance actually started quite small, a way of seeing was born in this period that was more revolutionary than anything we can imagine now. As students of literature and art, we are actually uniquely situated to recognize this shift, which has to do with the nature of what we like to think of as a self. And this is really going to be the main focus of my Shakespeare lectures, this idea of a self. So let me use this Lego analogy. You know, if you think of consciousness, in other words, all the ideas and feelings that you carry around in your head, as a Lego structure, a kind of Lego world that you carry around in your head, then the medieval Lego structure was being broken down in the Renaissance, and a new structure of consciousness was being assembled. So what I'm saying is that people actually started thinking in a new way. that the ideas that they'd always taken for granted as simple and self-evident truths were being taken apart in a really unsettling and radical way. This new structure that was being built at the time is in fact our own modern world, our own way of seeing. That's why this period is also called the early modern period. It was a modern notion of the world that was emerging, one that we are stuck with until today. I suspect that a new revolution is busy happening around us right now to do with social media, technological advances, and the internet. We are in fact moving into a new, you could call it post-human world, but it's happening so slowly that we can't really see it. I think, and I'm just speculating here, but I think 500 years from now, if there are still people around, they'll be talking about two great revolutions of consciousness. The Renaissance would be the first one, which spread to the rest of the world, and then the post-human revolution from around 2000 to, say, 2200. To understand who we are, where we come from, we need to understand what happened in the Renaissance. And by we, I do mean everyone, because, and this is really important, it's important especially for reading the Tempest, the Renaissance also marked the beginning of globalization. No corner of the world was ultimately spared its impact. So in this Lego analogy, well, what do the Lego blocks correspond to? You know, what are these building blocks that make up our inner world? I would argue that they're largely social. So they are the ideas and the values and the beliefs that we find around us. For instance, 100 years from now, an anthropologist will be able to look at our clothes, if they have videos or photos or whatever. And they'd say, oh, these people must be from around 2020. Now, how would this anthropologist know? He or she would know because you've assembled your outfit from what was available in the shops, right? What was fashionable, what was acceptable to your society. And there would be records of all these things. So you might do it in an adventurous and unique way, but it's still possible to say, this is the culture that you must have derived from. And something analogous happens inside our minds. We dress our thoughts in a particular way. In many ways, you could think of literature as a kind of externalization of consciousness, a sort of a snapshot of the way a particular writer or artist or a group of writers and artists imagined the world. I'm using a lot of analogies, but let me use one more. It's as if people downloaded their way of seeing the world onto a hard drive, right? And when you read it later, it's almost like you upload it again into your own mind. And kind of miraculously, we find ourselves seeing the world the way people did 500 years ago, for instance. Now, this is one of the capacities of literature. It's one of its almost alchemical powers. If you really want to push the analogy, you could say our software is no longer compatible, right? So we have to learn how to read the file. And that's kind of what we're doing here at university. Once you can inhabit this new way of seeing the world, it raises fascinating questions about your own situation, your own state of mind, your own location in culture. And this is, by the way, what drew me to the Renaissance when I was 22 years old and a student. There was this remarkable moment for me where the language stopped looking strange. And it felt like I was reaching across time, speaking to the dead, finding the origin of so many things that we just take for granted now. So it wasn't really about new insights into science or new ways of painting or sculpting, even though, you know, all these things were happening. Crucially, it was about a radical ontological shift. In other words, the way people thought about being changed in the Renaissance, and it has never changed back. all our ideas about what it means to be a self, to be responsible for ourselves, date back to this time. All the other changes go back to this revolutionary change in self-conception that you find in the Renaissance. Look at something that Shakespeare's Hamlet says. I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. My dad actually used to quote this to me to cheer me up when I was a kid. Yeah, I come from a strange family. Hamlet is articulating an entirely new way of understanding what it means to be a self. No matter, right, if we've got to translate this, no matter what my circumstances are, he's saying, I'm free in my mind. Except, right, were it not that I have bad dreams, except that sometimes my mind tortures me. That is to say, there's a difference between the external world and my interior world. I have autonomy, but it's not always easy to be autonomous. Now, for medieval thinkers, in other words, before the Renaissance, this was simply irrelevant. A peasant was a peasant, a nobleman, a nobleman. The difference between what we now call our real selves and our social role was simply unimportant. I'm not saying it didn't exist, I'm just saying it had no importance. And they certainly never thought that this part of you that's not exactly the same as your social role is significant, or that it defines you in some way. It's also, and this is crucial, a way of saying I can change who I am through an act of will. In other words, my shape is not fixed. I can in a way give birth to a new self. I have ultimate authority over who I am. Not the church, not the state, not social convention. Absolutely central to humanism. It's a new philosophy. Without this, we couldn't have had Copernicus or Descartes or Montaigne or Immanuel Kant or Freud or Oprah Winfrey or Paris Hilton or Foucault or George Bush or Jean-Paul Sartre, even Donald Trump, believe it or not. What Hamlet is voicing here is the foundations of Western modernity in these three lines. Have a look at some of Oprah's rules for living that I found online. My philosophy is that not only are you responsible for your life, but doing the best at this moment puts you in the best place for the next moment, says Oprah. So for her, the self is something that develops over time. Medieval thinkers did have set life stages, but Oprah's being a lot more teleological here. We are each responsible for our own life. No other person is or even can be. Now, again, this would be heresy in a medieval context. A whole range of social agents exercise power over you. Your own will for medieval people is by nature weak and corrupt. And you should definitely not be responsible for yourself. So this is also, it's kind of a new idea. Whatever you fear has no power. It is your fear that has the power. I don't know if you see the echo there with Hamlet's bad dreams. But again, if you're a medieval subject, the thing that you, hopefully, from the point of view of the church and the state, fear most is hell. And hell does have a very real material urgency. You're not fearing fear, you're fearing burning eternally in the flames of hell. So Oprah relies on this idea of the individual as agented and autonomous and defined through a process of introspection and self-transformation. There's a difference between your internal world and your internal suffering on the one hand, and on the other hand, the demands and social roles of the external world. These are seen as two completely separate things. This distinction is definitely not made in the same way in medieval thought. It was really something new, at the risk of becoming very repetitive. All the ideas that we inherited from the Renaissance have kind of started to become our own society's cliches. Profound philosophical insights have kind of turned into Oprah Winfrey sayings for us. And this is why Shakespeare is so exciting. In England, he kind of stood at the cusp between the old world and the new. And this new world is the one that we inhabit, right? It's become completely naturalized for us. To go back to Shakespeare means to go back to the dawn of our own modern sensibility. We see, when you read his plays, how it's generated. But we also still see in Shakespeare what is other, what doesn't quite belong to our own time. The Renaissance is like the fake sky in this picture. Makes me think of the Truman Show, if you've ever watched that film. When you reach this point, right, where the fake sky ends, you kind of encounter the shell of this bubble that we live in, the horizon of our reality. It's like beyond the Renaissance, we kind of just have the clockwork of the universe, like in this picture. So that limit stage, that barrier that the figure is poking his head through, is a time that's both strange and familiar. It's kind of at the very limits of our own being. And that's where Renaissance writing, that's where Shakespeare is located. Now, in my next video, I'm going to give you some examples from music and art and literature to help you understand what this shift looked like in practice. And I will post the next video as soon as I can. Thanks everyone. Bye.